All right, with that, ladies and gentlemen, we're on to fan favorites, shout outs, and rants. Mr. Armstrong has a hard stop at the top of the hour, so we're going to let him go first. What do you got for us, Mr. Armstrong?
Yeah, thanks very much. So, having knocked one side of the political aisle, maybe my rant is about the other. And it's about the tactic of what I'd call salami slice announcements, where politicians, and you've seen corporations do it as well, they give a little bit of the story, then they're pressed and they give a little bit more and they give a little bit more. And such an example is Michael Matheson, the Scottish Health Secretary. He's a member of the SNP party. And he had some criticism over an £11,000 connection bill for his tablet. It's a government issued tablet and it's meant to be a secure way of communicating. And originally, it seemed the story was that he'd neglected to swap his SIM card. So the SIM card deal came up at the Scottish Parliament, and he was meant to swap from network provider A to network provider B. And the reason we were given for the high charges initially was he'd forgotten to swap out his cell card, and the roaming charges when he went on holiday to Morocco were greater as a result. The story went on for about a week, and we eventually find out that why it's £11,000 is yes, he hasn't swapped his SIM card when he's been told to a number of times. But the real issue wasn't the constituency business that he said he was conducting, and which had allowed him to allocate, I think, £3,000 of the bill to his constituency funds. It was the fact that it seems that one or both of his sons had been using the iPad whilst in Morocco as a tether effectively to watch the Celtic game live, or maybe more than one Celtic game. It seems that they paid £7,000 in roaming charges billed back to the Scottish government to watch the Celtic game whilst on holiday. And Matheson has said that he effectively salami cut his announcement because the boys weren't in politics and he was. Now, that's running as thin as a slice of salami with a as a defense here. So I guess my rant, but my plea to politicians is sometimes things go wrong, and maybe it wasn't your fault, but you've made the situation much worse by not confessing at the start. And can we have an end to salami cut announcements? And with that, I must bid you all adieu and thank you for listening. And I'll listen to the other rants on the catch up, and I'm looking forward to them. And apologies for leaving.
We will say adios and we'll pass it over across the pond to Matt Kelly. What do you have for us today, Matt?
Yeah, Tom. So I have a shout out this week in the form of a quick book review. I am here to recommend a new book that came out earlier this fall called Our Least Important Asset by a business professor at Wharton by the name of Peter Cappelli. And so he explores the question of if our most important asset is human capital and employees. And every single company always says the people are our most important asset. If that is true, then why do our financial reporting rules treat employees as liabilities? And he goes from there. It is a fascinating look at how we pay executives to increase shareholder value, but we have created a system of financial reporting rules that make employees an expense. And so therefore, if they are harming shareholder value, you need to get rid of them as much as possible and hire as few people as possible all the time. Simple example, if I'm running a company and I buy a $100,000 laser cutter, that's a $100,000 asset. I get to put it on the books. It's something of value. If I hire a great salesperson and pay them $100,000, that's an expense and it doesn't show up anywhere. And there's no reflection that having a great salesman is clearly an asset to the company. Or if you upgrade that laser cutter by $10,000, Now it's worth $110,000 on my balance sheet. But if I give that salesman $10,000 in training, and now they're making even 3 times as much in revenue, it's just an expense and it doesn't show up anywhere. And now I get the objection a lot of people will raise is that a laser cutter can't decide one day to quit and walk out the company. Fair, except would that not mean, therefore, that we should try to incentivize companies to keep employees around for the long term, as opposed to incentivizing them to make it as pain-free as possible when the employee leaves? So I'm going to cut the training budget. I'm going to not pay them much money. I'm not going to hire a lot of employees, which is actually what we do in corporate America. When everybody says, I wish I could have a great steady job that pays a good income and I could stay with them for 30 years, sure, I'd be happy to do that. It is a fascinating look at how topsy-turvy all of our financial reporting rules are that have made modern employment generally a miserable experience that, by the way, doesn't actually add any value to the company anyways. That would be much better to focus on our most important asset. But instead, we treat them as the least important asset, by Peter Cappelli. So if you're looking for a good book to read, go find that at your local library and give it a read.
Karen Woody, do you have a shout out or rant for us?
I have a very quick shout out that harkens back to previous shout outs, and this one has to do with last Saturday. Megan Rapinoe and Ali Krieger took the pitch for the last time in their professional careers, playing against each other, these two sort of giants of women's soccer. And so it's just a shout out to how much the world has changed since they started playing soccer. And a lot of that was because of them. As controversial as maybe at least Megan Rapinoe has been at times, I actually think it's been good controversy and has resulted in great strides for women in sports. So that was just a shout out and hats off to the two of them.
Jay Rosen, what do you have for us today?
I've got a positive shout out to Giles Martin, who's George Martin's son, who has taken the mantle to remaster the Red and the Blue albums. That this is probably past some of your time, but I remember being in New York City, going to a department store called Corvettes with a C or maybe a K, and going in there and buying the Red and the Blue albums. And then flash forward to 1987 when I moved out here to California, and the Red and the Blue albums came out on DVD, or rather CD, for the first time. So it's amazing how the Beatles catalog is just such an evergreen. And I can't say that I'm a fan of the song Now and Then, which they posthumously recorded with John Lennon's voice. But I got to tell you, everything else about A Day in the Life and hearing this stuff all cleaned up and remastered, it just brings the music to life. So here's a positive shout out to AI and everything that came out of the Get Back movie to give people technical tools to take things from our past and re-listen to them in a new way. So that's my shout out.
So I'm going to have my first quadruple shout out, and it involves the ransomware gang Alpha / Black Cat, shout out number one, who has taken extortion to a new level by filing an SEC complaint against one of their alleged victims because their victim did not comply with the 4-day rule to disclose a cyber attack. Meridian Link was threatened. Alpha Black Cat would go to the SEC. They did not disclose, and they went to the SEC. So that's shout out number one. Number two, Matt Levine, writing in Bloomberg, called it, quote, maybe the most money stuff story I've ever written about, end quote. Shout out number three, Bruce Carton, who in his daily update from the securities docket said, quote, I urge you to read his whole column that covers not just this outrageous story, but also includes a great segment on how the SEC's lucrative whistleblower program is going to be professionalized. The center of gravity is going to shift from amateur whistleblowers, i.e. those who happen to have worked on fraud once, to professionals, people whose whole job is finding fraud and profiting from it. And finally, to the journalistic site Bleeping Computer for breaking the story. Great episode, ladies and gentlemen, and I can't wait to see what we can come up with.
Good to see you all.
This is Tom Fox again. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Everything Compliance, Shout Outs and Rants. If you've enjoyed this episode, I hope you will listen to the entire Everything Compliance episode, which posts on Thursday, November 30th. If you've enjoyed this podcast, I hope you'll subscribe, rate, and review wherever great podcasts are listened to. Everything Compliance, Shout Outs and Rants is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.